As part of the Fulbright Distinguished Awards and Teaching Grant, I've spent the past 5 months in India looking at new initiatives in vocational education. As a vocational teacher in the US, I thought it was a timely subject because both countries are really looking to increase post-secondary workforce readiness. In my state of Colorado, for example, we've passed the new Individualized Career and Academic Plan for students to look at potential pathways upon graduation. And here in India, there's been a new push for a national skills qualification framework. The term, by the way, vocational, has been replaced in the U.S. with career and technical education, primarily because of the negative connotation vocational seems to have, which is a shame, really, because the root of the word, vocare, to call or to find one's calling, is pretty indicative of the major benefits of vocational education at the secondary level. So why India? Well, both countries have a similar skills gap. We'll talk about this definition in just a minute. And both have certain hierarchies of knowledge that value some careers more than others. But primarily it's because both countries are really pushing through policy new ways to help connect kids with life after high school. And there's a lot of different reasons why, statistically. Both the impact it has on the individual student as well as the community. Even students that go on to higher education, as we're seeing both in the US and in India, are often jobless or finding themselves underemployed. And this has, again, long-term impacts on both the individual and the community in which they live. As far as economics go, industry is suffering too because many jobs are remaining vacant simply because there aren't enough qualified graduates to fill them. There's currently 17 different ministries that are involved in skill development in India, but I really was here to focus on a new policy through the Ministry of Human Resource Development that was looking to implement vocational programming in government secondary schools. It was launched 3 years ago, and currently there's just under 3,000 schools with new vocational programming so far in classes 9 through 10, with the next 2 years before students fully graduate. So I looked at all different parts of the policy, and many of these were based on international models as well. And while no one model is going to work for every place, there are certainly best practices that can be gleaned and applied to and integrated into any models. And that's what I really wanted to focus on. I've chosen 5 in my research that I think both India and the US are either developing or could continue to develop with more strength to help improve vocational programming. There's a lot of reasons why. A lot of benefits to vocational education. You can see these studies cited at the end of my presentation. But despite that, there's still a lot of challenges in its implementation, including a negative bias towards vocational education, the thought that vocational education is only for poor kids or kids that can't hack it in a traditional academic classrooms, which, as we'll find from the research, is not the case. Anytime one of the best practices addresses a critical challenge, I've started just so that we can kind of remember our goals. In my research, I really found out that this term, skills gap, which we use both in the US and abroad, has 3 separate meanings, which are related but have different causations and also different solutions. The traditional meaning is that there's skills that students are graduating with and they do not match what industry needs. Related to this, but very specific, are the global competence skills, the soft skills, or what I want to call professional skills, collaboration, communication, that all students need for any profession they aren't leaving our classrooms with. And finally, from the student perspective, the gap between the kind of strengths and skills and interests that students have and the knowledge of what kind of career pathways are out there in which they can demonstrate these. So just a lack of knowledge between the educational system and the workforce. I had a lot of acronyms on my methodologies, the policy review that I did at the national level, as well as the concepts and concept notes that helped shape it from an international level. I spent a lot of time reviewing curriculum, the new sector skills councils made up of industry members that devised the different national occupation standards, presently for 91 different job roles. And then I looked at the people writing the curriculum, the Central Institute for Vocational Education, National Skills Development Corporation. This is at the secondary level, as well as at the post-secondary level, and the relationship between the two. And I also spent a lot of time looking at implementation through interviews, both with NGOs that helped shape policy, as well as schools, so visiting schools, talking to principals, to teachers, and of course to students. And from those, I've chosen the 5 best practices that I'd like to look at with you now. Demand-driven rather than supply-driven. Vocational programs that are succeeding are doing so because they're looking at data from industry, learning about the different types of career skills that are needed, both technical and professional, and then helping those to drive programming decisions. This helps bridge that gap in a variety of different ways and also creates meaningful pathways for students to apply what they're learning in their academic and vocational classes. The good news is this data exists. At the national level in India, the National Skills Development Corporation has created a skills gap analysis of each state. Our own Bureau of Labor and Statistics does this each year and publishes findings in its handbook. At the state level, we also have different information about the different skill sectors and the job roles within those sectors that are growing. So the piece that I'd like to make a recommendation on happens at this local level. And my recommendation is that there needs to be a advisory committee that's localized. Pardon me. So for example, my program in agriculture at Boulder Valley School District had an advisory committee, and they helped advise on trends in the industry. They helped approve curriculum, helped students connect with meaningful professional development opportunities, but they couldn't tell me if our district should offer a manufacturing program, for example. So too, at the national level and even the state level, India can have industries that are hiring, but not necessarily with jobs within a student's community. And so there needs to be a district level advisory committee that helps advise this. In my district, that can look like Chamber of Commerce, Workforce Boulder County. In India too, industry leaders, as well as the local panchayats. If we've been successful in doing this, then we really worked to help close that gap so that 100% of graduates, BVSD or the National Skills Qualification graduates, are enrolled in some kind of post-secondary opportunities through education or training or formally employed within 1 year of graduation. So our NEET rate would be 0. Now, we can't just plug students into careers just because the demand exists. We also need to focus, and best practices do focus, on a student-centered model. And this means that students are given meaningful opportunities to kind of explore their own aptitudes and interests and then see how those relate safely in a professional environment. This allows students to drive the process and creates a natural pathway or pipeline for students to help apply the skills that they're learning, again, both academically and potentially in a vocational classroom, to potential jobs. Again, we do have some resources around this. Currently in the state of Colorado, in my district, we're using Naviance, an online tool to help build professional goals and post-secondary plans, but we can implement and supplement this with more student-centered learning, like the Indigo aptitude test. In India here, there's a great model My Kensho has created that looks at students exploring their own personal identities and then the world around them and relating that, again, as a pathway to post-secondary plans. So my recommendation here is to continue to utilize these tools, but also look at building around them curriculum that helps further support student-directed career exploration. So in my district, that might look like linking outcomes with those sort of aptitude tests or activities with course offerings within our district. That might include vocational training that's being offered in the schools. And then also placing all of this within the framework of ICAP. So it's not isolated little activities that counselors lead, but instead an overall framework that looks at students becoming increasingly more aware of their own interests and aptitudes. In India, the Central Institute of Vocational Education is already developing curriculum modules, so why not one that looks at, again, career exploration in the framework of personal interests. This My Kensho model is being piloted in Kerala, so it'd be interesting to see the results of that in the next few years. If we've done this well, then students will leave high school with at least 1 or 2 career pathways of interest. So then they're not just graduating and then wondering what comes next. They've already gotten an opportunity to kind of think about and potentially explore what that looks like in the real world. Now, both of the previous best practices are already to some degree being implemented in both countries, but this next one is my favorite and one that I think could really revolutionize education, and that's 100% participation. This is the idea that it's not just certain students that can benefit from vocational education, but that all students can. This helps end that negative bias, that negative social bias against CTE coursework, and it also allows every student to benefit from exploring their calling and developing these kind of soft skills that all students need. Currently, there aren't a lot of models doing this anywhere. One example is in Germany, where 100% of all students are required to do a 3 to 4 week internship that they design and implement and then report back on by the time they finish the first few years of secondary school. How this could look in our classrooms in the US or in India might start off with more teacher-directed or council-directed activities. Every student needs to learn how to ace a job interview or create a CV, but becomes increasingly more specialized based, again, on that student-driven approach that might culminate in job shadowing or potentially internships. So my recommendation, first off, is to create a platform for that kind of curriculum, grades 6 through 12 in the US, class 9 through 12 in India, that lets students explore themselves, their community, and that also gives educators a platform to upload good lessons that might be content-based within math or English. For example, if I'm interviewing a professional for a personal narrative, that could be an activity that is based on language arts skills, but also relates to post-secondary workforce readiness. So I've gone ahead and created that. Our school district has a learning management system called Schoology, and I've created those resources here. And within each of these grades are student-directed, teacher-directed, and counselor-directed activities. So these can be populated by teachers within a district. This is a free, open to everyone, open source resource. And I'll show you how to sign up for that in a minute. If we've been successful, here's how we'll measure it. Work-based. So here's an area that both the US and India do well, but they do it in different ways. And this is the idea that we need to move away from theory and in our pedagogy and methodologies and have a lot more practical experience for students so that they can learn by doing and also develop those professional skills because they're in a professional environment. There's a lot of ways that this can look. In the traditional vocational classroom in the US, we have a lab where students can practice skills. In India, with more limited resources, they're relying more on field visits, for example. But putting these together can be beneficial to all students. So really looking for as many opportunities as possible to bring professionals into the classroom and to bring students into the workforce. And again, there's a lot of ways this can happen. My recommendation for both countries is to look first at creating a learning ecosystem. And what this looks like is community resources. So individuals maybe who have retired from different professions, corporations that are interested in some sort of training program, informal learning opportunities that exist in so many different places in every community, and really looking at creating opportunities for students and for the community to come into schools through projects like internships or mentorships. This might look like a learning database at first, and so students can have access to names, numbers, contact information about whom they might want to interview if they had that language arts project, for example. If we've been successful, then students are comfortable with, not just have an opportunity, but are comfortable with interacting with professionals at any level in any different career sector. And this idea was based on the concept of a learning city that's happening kind of worldwide, and I had a chance to visit this in the city of Udaipur. So one goal might be to make Boulder a learning city by 2018, but that's another project. Finally, my last best practice that I'd like to focus on, and one that really was the bulk of where I spent my time with my inquiry project, was that of being process focused. And so what this looks like are not just individual training programs in a particular vocational field, so a student enrolls in one class, but instead is looking at this as a kind of a holistic pipeline where students start off with very broad professional skill development, inquiries into the workforce, and personal development, and it becomes increasingly more specific and student directed so that a student can start off with activities that might support an ICAP or support post-secondary workforce readiness, but then really take over by the time that they're finishing secondary school to focus on a specific project. And this helps develop soft skills as well as help formulate a plan for life after high school. So along with this curriculum platform, with multiple exits and entries, so students can have a lot of different choices here, and with increasingly different choices and more individualized choices as they go through secondary school. But the recommendation I have here is the creation of a capstone project. So along with this curriculum platform starting in grade 9 or class 9 in India, the idea that there is a self-selected, student-designed project that we'll call a capstone. And by the way, this curriculum I've created is free and open to anyone. You need only to create use this access code. If you don't have an account on Schoology, again, it's free. It's just www.schoology.com. So what this doesn't look like is just a very specialized vocational program for only some students, but instead a pipeline for all students. And we aren't just looking at, okay, I've checked the box, I've talked to kids about college scholarships, but instead has a student really look at what their interests are, and maybe develops a learning community, creates a project that has both vocational as well as academic standards that are met, and finally creates a project, presents a project, receives feedback on a project, and also examines what to do next if this is an area of interest of theirs. So it becomes more of a pathway that is student driven. So here's my recommendation. And if we've been successful, then when these students leave, they've had this kind of rich opportunity to develop soft skills, professional